This system right here next to me is one of, if not the fastest gaming PC in the world. We built this on stream on the channel on Thursday, and not only does it feature an absolutely monstrous RTX 3090 Founders Edition, but also the brand new flagship from AMD, their 16-core, 32-thread 5950X. Now, we didn't get a chance to performance test it on the stream because honestly, we just kind of ran out of time. But today I wanted to put it through its paces and also show you guys what kind of performance scaling you get with different kinds of overclocks on the new 5000 series Ryzen chips. Corsair introduces their newest RGB-infused peripheral to help you get a leg up on the competition, the Darkcore RGB Pro. An 18,000 DPI PixArt optical sensor gives you unparalleled precision, while the interchangeable side grips mean that you could customize the look and feel of the Darkcore to meet your needs. You also get premium features like USB-C charging, switches rated for 50 million clicks, 8 programmable buttons, 50 hours of battery life, and onboard profile storage. Check out the link below or head to Corsair.com to learn more. So before we get into things today, if you like this kind of content and you want to see more of my PC builds and performance evaluations, make sure that you get subscribed to BPS Customs at the link down below, and also toss this video a like if you found it useful in any way. Now, if you want to find out more about this system, how we put it together, what parts are in it, I'm going to link you guys to this video up here, which is the entire live stream build. But just to recap for you, there's a 5950X underneath that Be Quiet Pure Loop 280 cooler. The motherboard is an Asus Crosshair 8 Hero, and the memory is from G.Skill. It's their Trident Z Neo, a 4x8 gig kit of DDR4 3600. Obviously, the graphics card is from NVIDIA. It's their RTX 3090 Founders Edition. The case is from Fantex. It's their P360A. The power supply is from Inwin. It's their C1250. A little bit overkill for this system, but that's fine. And lastly, the storage. I put a single NVMe drive from Samsung in our original build, and I did mention that I wanted to swap it out and do a fresh Windows install before I did my performance testing, and that's exactly what we've done. But the storage for our purposes today is not really relevant. What we're going to be focusing on is the data. So not only are frames per second in some games, but also thermal data, power consumption, frequency, and production benchmarks. Now, I have been preaching for quite a while now, basically since 3rd gen Ryzen came out, that the way AMD's boost algorithm works means that you're almost always better off leaving your processors at their stock settings and letting them manage the boost themselves rather than try to lock them into an all-core frequency. The reason for that is different applications utilize a different number of cores and or threads in your system, and if you lock a processor to, let's use an example, 4.5 gigahertz all-core, that might be great for an all-core workload, but if you have something that runs on 1, 2, 3, or 4 cores, like a game or something like that, and you have the system locked to 4.5, whereas on its own it would boost to 4.8 for those couple of cores, well, then you're actually losing out on quite a bit of performance. AMD has been refining this system since Ryzen first launched in 2017, and it's at the point now where I think for 95% of people, it's good enough where you don't really have to change very much at all. There are a couple of settings that I would recommend getting into if you want to optimize that performance, but as far as an all-core overclock goes, it's almost not really worth it. However, we are not here to pass judgment on those who want to do an overclock like this, and we're going to provide you with some data as far as what actually happens when you do something like that. In order to make these comparisons, as you should always be doing when you're doing any kind of performance evaluation, we laid down a baseline. This involved running the system as it is out of the box, completely stock. I didn't change a single thing. That means that our CPU was boosting on its own, the fan curves were set on their own, the GPU was doing its own thing, and the memory was running at its stock settings. The next thing I did was the most basic overclock that you can possibly do on any modern system, and that was just to enable the memory to run at its rated frequency. In the ASUS BIOS, this is how you do it. It's a very simple process. It's basically just a couple of clicks and then you hit save and reset. Your system reboots and your memory will be running at its rated speed. In our case, that's 3600 megahertz, and with Ryzen, that definitely makes a huge difference. The next thing that I tried with very mixed results was the Auto OC feature of AMD's Ryzen Master software. I've never been a huge fan of Ryzen Master, but I have to admit, over the years, it has gained functionality and streamlined the application such that I actually don't really mind it very much at all. It does have a feature in it that allows you to have the system configure an overclock that fits the thermal and power limitations that you're facing, and then stress test it. So that's what we did. I hit the Auto OC, I hit apply and test. The system did its thing, it configured an overclock, and we got a result. And then the fourth way that we tested everything was with a manual overclock applied. I went into the BIOS, I did some basically trial and error, which is how you have to apply a manual CPU overclock. And the way we ended up was a 4.6 gigahertz all-core overclock at 1.33 volts. Now, one of the very important things to keep in mind when you are doing overclocking on an AMD Ryzen system is that a lot of the times the stock BIOS settings that come with these motherboards is overly aggressive, and it's going to cause your CPU to run at a higher temperature than it really needs to. So even though you might have a stock voltage setting of 1.4 or 1.45 volts on your processor, you don't actually need that even if you're going to try to clock it higher than it is at stock. In our case, the Corsair 8 Hero motherboard has an auto setting that basically runs the CPU at between 1.4 and 1.45 volts. And I was able to achieve 4.6 gigahertz all-core at 1.33 volts, a significant drop, and that allowed us to stay within thermal limits. Now, when playing around with all these different configurations, I ran a number of tests on this system and recorded all of my data here in a very primitive way on this piece of paper, and then transferred it over to a bunch of graphs for me to show you. The data that I collected includes average CPU temperature at load, peak power consumption at load measured through the Ryzen Master software, as well as a number of different benchmarks. So we had the Blender BMW scene, a Handbrake transcode. I also ran 3 different gaming tests, one in each relevant API. So that's Strange Brigade for Vulkan, for DX12 we had Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and then for DX11 we had Far Cry New Dawn. I also ran Cinebench, both multi-core and single-core, to see how our overclocks were affecting our overall performance and our very narrow focused single-threaded applications. Let's first start out by taking a look at temperatures. These were taken during the Handbrake transcode. So that is a test that typically takes between 3 and 5 minutes for the file that we were transcoding. So it gave enough of a time to give a good heat soak to our cooler, which was a 280 millimeter AIO. Now, granted, I understand that under longer stress, these temperatures might increase a little bit. However, it is going to give us a good rough estimate as to where we might stand for each setting. So for the stock settings for the CPU, that includes the all stock and the 3600 memory stock, we're running at 67C, which is well below the 85 or 90C. That is really the cap for these Ryzen processors. However, with the auto overclock applied, we hit that 85C number and in fact exceeded it on a couple of occasions, and this caused a problem. I likely think that this is because the voltage settings on the auto overclock were, as they are normally, way too aggressive. I was able to dial the voltage back a little bit for our manual overclock, and temperatures did fall just a bit. Taking a look at power consumption, also measured during the Handbrake transcode, we can see that the stock settings for our processor came in well below the overclock settings. Now, my manual overclock did draw a little bit extra power versus the auto OC, and I think that likely has something to do with the fact that because we were dialing our voltage back, the CPU was able to better maintain that 4.6 gigahertz number rather than kind of bounce around in frequency as the temperatures kind of get out of control. And I think that ultimately is what made the manual OC consume 180 watts versus 176 for the auto OC. Now this is just the processor, not total system power draw. And then here are the frequencies that I observed. Now for both stock settings, everything was basically the same. The single core was operating, boosting up to 5 gigahertz, while the all-core loads were basically hitting 3.9, 3.95 gigahertz. The auto OC had a single core hit 4.8 gigahertz, but that was brief. It did kind of come back down to about 4.7, and then all cores were sitting between 4.4 and 4.5. So again, we are going to take a look at what this means for our scores a little bit later on, but just keep in mind that because temperatures were so high, we weren't seeing this be very consistent. There were definitely dips at times, and this did affect our scores. And then for the manual overclock, things did stay rock solid at 4.6 gigahertz across the board, both single core and multi-core. For our very first actual results, let's take a look at a test that you guys are all familiar with, Cinebench R20. Now, these Ryzen 3rd gen processors are actually much stronger in IPC than their previous generations, and also stronger than Intel for the very first time. You could see that in the single threaded scores, where the stock settings actually blew away anything that I had seen before. The all stock settings hit 636, and then as soon as we clicked the memory up to 3600 from its stock setting, we got an extra 7 points out of it. Now, that's not a lot, but it is definitely something, and it was repeatable in my testing. There is a problem, however. You can see that both auto OC and our manual OC gave us lower scores. And again, that goes back to what we said at the beginning of the video. The single core performance on these chips and the single core boost algorithm is really strong. And limiting that by capping the frequency with an overclock actually is a detriment to your single core performance. So in this case, we had single core performance on the auto OC of 4.8 gigahertz and single core performance on the manual overclock at only 4.6 gigahertz, thus the lower scores. When we move over to Cinebench AllCore, again, some very impressive numbers when it comes to the stock settings. 10,027 for everything stock, and then 10,123 with just the memory bumped up to 3,600. We saw 10,796 with our manual overclock because we were running at an all-core frequency that was much higher than anything else that we saw in our tests. However, even though the auto OC was supposed to be running almost as fast all core, again, the temperature and the voltage come into play where we saw a lot of fluctuation, and as a result, the scores actually went down versus our stock settings. The Blender BMW test was up next, and I saw no improvement moving between stock and the memory OC. This, I don't know if I expected or not, but because the test is pretty short, maybe that's why we didn't really see any variation, because it's not a huge change just bumping up the memory. However, when we moved to the auto overclock, again, we saw a detriment to our score, with it taking an extra 5 seconds to render the scene. My manual overclock, on the other hand, running at 4.6 across the board, did manage to shave 9 seconds off of the test. In Handbrake, the video file that I chose to transcode from 4K to 1080p was a 5 minute and 1 second Sony A7 III file from one of my videos here on YouTube. You can see at all stock settings, it transcoded in 3 minutes and 45 seconds. I was very surprised that just by bumping the memory up to 3600, we saw a significant drop in amount of time to do this task, and that was about equal with the manual overclock. They both came in around 3 minutes and 20 seconds. The auto overclock, however, really pooped the bed on this one, as because the load was so sustained for a longer amount of time, it caused more fluctuation and more degradation in our CPU frequency, and as a result, a very poor score. And then let's wrap it up by talking about gaming performance. Now, Ryzen traditionally wasn't the strongest in gaming. You had Intel beating it out basically since day one, and it's only really with this generation that AMD can claim the performance crown in gaming, and that extends from 1080p to 1440p to even 4K in some instances, even though you are severely GPU limited at that higher resolution. All of our gaming tests will run at 1080p, and I used Far Cry New Dawn for DX11, Shadow of the Tomb Raider for DX12, and Strange Brigade for Vulkan. Far Cry New Dawn was up first, and at stock settings, we got not a very impressive result. Far Cry New Dawn is heavily CPU dependent, and you saw a huge amount of fluctuation depending on how I had the CPU configured. At all stock, we were only getting 106 frames per second at 1080p with an RTX 3090. That's a crazy low number, but as soon as I clicked that memory up to 3600, there was a huge improvement to 134. Unfortunately, we saw a huge dip with the auto overclock back under 100 frames per second. This was really disappointing, but the manual overclock made back up some of that ground, back up to 123 frames per second. Because games tend not to utilize the entirety of the 16 cores on this chip, it's definitely advantageous to allow the AMD processors to boost 1, 2, or 4 cores on their own and get you that higher frame rate. We saw this repeat itself with Shadow of the Tomb Raider. 172 frames per second on average at all stock settings, bumped way up to 200 frames per second with just a memory increase. And then the auto OC, what a nightmare. 124 frames per second only in this test. 178 on the manual OC, which is better and better than our all stock settings. However, all you need to do in a lot of cases, especially when you're gaming, is just bump the memory up to its XMP profile or its rated speed, and then you'll be good to go. We see this once again in Strange Brigade, where the all stock settings were basically the same as the memory at 3600 settings, and then we hit the auto OC button and boom, 307 frames per second. That's a huge discrepancy. We came back up a little bit with the manual overclock, but man, if you're just gaming, there is no reason at all to be overclocking these chips manually. So that is a wrap on our, I guess, fastest gaming PC in the world version 3 for 2020, but that's okay. As long as new hardware keeps coming out, we'll keep reviewing it. We'll keep updating this kind of a project and showing you guys the data. I hope you enjoyed this kind of a video where we show you different kinds of performance scaling based on how you want to use your system and what kind of changes you might want to make manually or otherwise. Make sure you leave a like down below, get subscribed to the channel if this video helped you out at all and you want to see more of this kind of PC content, as well as builds, how-tos, and all kinds of other stuff. As always, guys, I really appreciate you watching. Thank you so much, and I will see you next time.